In this video I'm going to be making a coffee table using some old scaffold boards which I found on top of a skip, which I took after asking permission of course. The boards had loads of character, they were very worn and weathered, they were also pretty badly warped too. And I already had some metal legs to work with. I have a few of these and I've already used one pair on a beach and sapele tabletop that I made a few weeks ago. These have some floating top spacers on the top which I decided to remove because I don't really like them, and also they won't allow for expansion and contraction of the wooden top that I was planning to make. The legs measured 600mm, so that's how wide I wanted my tabletop to be. I started by removing a few blocks which were screwed into the boards. And there was a sneaky screw hiding on the inside too. And I could also remove this metal plate at the end. These boards measured 1600mm in length, so I decided to cut them in half, and after setting up a stop block at the mitre saw just shy of 800mm, I made the cuts. I needed to remove the warp from these boards, and normally I would plane one face flat and then thickness plane the opposite face, but the trouble with that is that the main thing I like about these boards is all of the character that they have, and if I planed them all of that character would be lost and this wood would just look like any other clean and kind of boring milled up piece of pine. So instead what I decided to do is rip the boards in half at the table saw. And then I made a series of rip cuts to both edges of each of the boards to get them at 90 degrees to the faces. I did leave a rustic edge on two of the pieces though, as I wanted to use those for what would be the edges of the tabletop. Next I could check each edge for squareness, and for any that were a little off, like this one, I took them back to the table saw again to rip off the edge and make it square. Here's the offcut and you can see that it's very slightly wedge shaped. Next I laid out the boards and I had enough here to give me the 600mm width I needed to span the metal legs I'd be using. With the boards laid out I realised that some of them were thicker than others by a couple of millimeters. So I pulled out all of the thicker boards and set up my thickness planer to plane the thicker boards to match the thickness of the thinner boards. These freshly planed clean faces would be placed facing downwards when I later glue up the tabletop so that they won't be seen. So now all of these pieces are the same thickness and all of the glue joints look nice and tight apart from one of them, which is this one here. So I'm just going to clean up these two edges with a hand plane until they fit together better. So these two boards are touching at both ends, but there's a gap in the middle. So one of the boards needs a little taken off each end, and I'm just sighting down the board to see if I can see which one isn't perfectly straight. And I think it's this one. I took a few shavings off each end of the board. So that's better, but there's still a gap in the middle. So I definitely need to take some off here and here. And then they went together pretty good. I'd use my parallel clamps to glue up the top. Once I'd added glue to all of the joints, I could make sure that all of the ends were flush and then tighten the clamps. I find it easier and quicker doing it this way rather than taking the time to add biscuits or dowels to all of the joints. And as wood glue is stronger than the wood itself when used on side grain joints like these, the top didn't need any reinforcing. I cleaned up excess glue with a damp cloth, and I added some clamps from above too to try and evenly distribute the pressure on both sides of the tabletop. I used my mallet just to make sure that the boards were sitting flat on the shaft of the clamps, and that worked in most places, but I needed a bit more pressure on some boards, so I added some F clamps with a couple of blocks to get everything nice and flat. While the tabletop was clamped up, I got started working on the legs, which I wanted to paint. I sanded using 240 grit, which I thought would help the paint adhere better to the metal. Then with some white spirit on a piece of cloth, I could clean off the dust and they were ready for painting. I picked this mustard yellow colour as I wanted the legs to really pop against the wooden tabletop. This spray paint was only £5 on Amazon and I was super impressed with it. The nozzle on the can is excellent at distributing the paint evenly, and coverage was really good too. I'll leave a link to this spray paint in the description box below if you're interested. After spraying on the first coat, I left it about an hour to dry and then recoated it, and then the colour looked great, really vibrant. And once that coat had dried, I came back with some spray varnish to add a layer of protection over the paint. With the glue now dry on the tabletop, I wanted to find a way to make the end grain on the freshly cut pieces match the worn and weathered end grain. So I used a blowtorch to char the ends, which raised the grain quite nicely, and then used a wire brush. I came back a few times with the torch and wire brush to try and kind of blend in how it looked with the other pieces. Next I sanded the tabletop using 80 grit, and I'm trying to get a smooth enough surface and remove any wood that was likely to splinter, but also trying to retain the rustic look and texture as much as possible. I sanded the end grain too and eased over the corners, and then I needed to top up the burning a bit more. I did a bit of light burning to the tabletop too, mainly to restore a bit of the colour that was lost through sanding the wood. And the beauty of this method is that if you accidentally burn a bit too much in one area, you can knock it back again with the wire brush. I did the final sanding by hand at 120 grit. Before applying a finish, I blew away as much of the dust as possible. I decided to use water-based varnish for the tabletop. I chose this because I didn't want to yellow the pine, which an oil-based finish would have done. This brought out the grain really nicely and added a nice bit of colour to the wood too. Once the first coat had dried, I added a second coat, and this varnish came out a bit more glossy than I would have liked. So later on I took some 4/0 steel wool and rubbed on some of my homemade wax, and by the way, this is available to buy via my Etsy store. I later buffed out the wax, and this gave the tabletop more of a satin sheen, which was what I wanted. I added my maker's mark to the bottom of the tabletop. To fit the top to the legs, I first needed to drill some holes through the metal legs using a step cutting bit in my drill, and I made these holes quite wide because I wanted to allow the wood to expand and contract with seasonal changes. And then I secured the legs to the top using some screws and washers.
I really enjoyed this build. Like I said at the start, it's been a long time since I've done anything with a rustic feel, and it was nice to work on something that didn't require much finesse or precision, and it was quick too. I managed to get the table done within 5 or 6 hours, mainly thanks to having those ready-made legs. Quick and simple, and I think the table looks great. Those boards have so much character, and the yellow paint for the legs give it a more modern look and add a bit of fun. The table is now available for sale via my Etsy store, link to that in the description box below if you're interested. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.